This story is one of the creepiest true stories I've ever heard. It's a story that makes you wonder about what people's true intentions really are. Most of us have at least one person in our lives that we feel we can trust with anything and everything. But no matter how much you trust anybody, you never really know what's actually going on inside their head. Do the words they tell you really match the thoughts that they're having behind them? No matter how much you trust somebody, you never really know what they might be thinking, or what they might be doing in their spare time. Our story today starts off in December of 1986 in a small town from Massachusetts. Frank Bowen lived together with his two young daughters, Tina and Karen. Recently, they had just lost their mother to cancer, and it was a very hard time for everybody. To make matters worse, the household was now only under one income, so Frank started to work more and more hours just to make sure they could still get by. Because of this, he began leaving the girls home alone more often than usual. One evening, while Frank was working, Tina and Karen would be at home continuing to find ways to cope with the loss of their mother. That night, they attempted to find further closure. Their way of doing this was by bringing out a Ouija board and conducting a seance, hoping that in doing so, they would be able to speak with their mother one last time. But sadly, nothing was happening. The idea seemed like it was turning into a dead end. Eventually, feeling tired, emotionally drained, and hopeless, they decided to give up and head to their bedrooms to get some rest. Some hours would pass until the two girls would be woken up by a startling sound. They sat upright, listening closely. It sounded like a quiet tapping sound, but where was it coming from? Staying quiet and listening even closer, they waited, trying to figure out what was happening. They couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but it sounded like it was coming from inside their walls. And as they listened, the knocking would only grow louder. Both of them came to the realization that the seance must have worked. They thought to themselves their mother must have actually heard them. When their father Frank would later come home, they would tell him all about the experience. He didn't believe them and brushed it off entirely. The intense stress from their loss must have been taking its toll, playing mean tricks on their imaginations in an attempt to find peace. Concerned, he told his daughters that if this were to continue, he would be taking them all for counseling. All he wanted was for his daughters' peace of mind. It was all too much, and he wished for their family's troubles just to discontinue. Unfortunately, this was just the beginning. Night after night, again and again, the girls would be awoken by the same unnerving knocking sounds that they heard before. Each time they would scream for their father, but every single time he would arrive, the sounds would come to a halt. He opened the door. He listened. Silence was all that he could hear, and now his concern for them would only increase. Over the next few weeks, things would only seem to escalate as the events they experienced became stranger and stranger. The knocking became more consistent. It was to the point that it was ruining the girls' sleep, the noise slowly driving them insane. But now, that wasn't the only thing that was happening. Their possessions began to disappear, somehow misplacing themselves. Items that they were certain were in different places the day prior would be found thrown across the floor or moved to a different location. They would come home to find furniture moved to the other side of the room, seemingly all on its own. They were all experiencing the same thing together, but their father Frank wasn't buying it. His daughters insisted that they had nothing to do with it and that it must be a ghost, but he couldn't get himself to believe such a ridiculous idea. Frank thinking to himself that his daughters were under such emotional distress that they must be the culprits for all of this. The knocking and everything else continued into the new year, but for one January evening, something was different. It didn't sound like the knocking was coming from the walls this time. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. Terrified but curious, they grabbed a kitchen knife and shakily made their way down to the depths of their home. When they got to the bottom, The noise had ceased, and they froze as they saw something that they knew wasn't supposed to be there. On the basement wall, written in dark red, was a message they wished they never saw. "I'm in your room. Come and find me." Horrified, they ran out of the house as quickly as possible, making their way to their neighbors to tell them what happened. When their father arrived, they explained to him what happened, but again, he just thought that they were doing this as a failed way of coping. The stress must have been manipulating their minds into doing crazy things. Following this, he would send them for counseling. But things only continued to get worse. Many weeks later, the girls would hear even more knocking. This time, the sound emanating from behind Tina's bedroom wall. Upon entering Tina's room, they were met with another horribly read message sprawled across the walls. "I'm back. Find me if you can." Fearful for their lives, they went over to a neighbor's house once more, calling their father to come home. When he got home this time, he was beyond fed up. He stormed inside to prove that there was nobody there. When he got inside, more had happened inside the house than the girls had originally explained. He started to understand that something else was going on. Somebody else must have been in here. Frank entered Tina's room by himself, and when he did, there was an extra message painted across the walls. "Marry me." He stared at the wall in disbelief as his mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. That's when he noticed something. On the other side of the room, a dark figure stood dressed in the clothing of his now deceased wife. Blonde hair hung down across the silhouette's shoulders, draping down to the hatchet that was held in its hand. Although that part of the story doesn't end there, we're going to need to go back to a time before the knocking began. The family would receive a phone call one day from a boy named Danny. Danny would say that he got their number from a friend that went to the same school as them. The picture Danny would paint of himself was that of a blonde, attractive, fit and smart boy that lived in the area. After a few phone calls, Tina and Danny began to grow closer with each other. He seemed like a nice guy, so one night, they organized for a date. The day for the date came by and Danny arrived at Tina's doorstep. She excitedly opened the door to greet him but quickly stopped in her tracks. Danny was nothing like he explained. He wasn't good looking at all. His hair wasn't blonde like he said, it was dark and greasy, and his appearance just looked disorganized. She decided to forget about it and they went out for a bit anyway. It only lasted a little over an hour before she decided to get herself out of there. During their date, the topic of the passing of her mother was brought up, and Danny seemed to take an unnaturally high interest in the subject. Tina would later say that it was like Danny was obsessed with the passing of her mother, questioning her often about how much she had suffered when it happened. Having a bad feeling about this, naturally, Tina didn't go on another date with Danny. She wouldn't pick up another call from him, and that was that. Or so she thought. Danny was a very psychologically disturbed individual. He had a very, very bad upbringing. He suffered an extremely traumatic childhood which warped his mind to an unrepairable state at an early age. His father would often abuse him physically, emotionally, and sexually. He struggled to make friends, he struggled with his grades, and he didn't have proper habits for hygiene. Most students at school thought he was creepy and weird. Concerned with his obviously abnormal behavior, school officials referred him to a psychiatrist. This same psychiatrist would sexually abuse Danny also, for an entire year. Seemingly everybody he trusted betrayed him. He turned to crime, and he began spending his evenings breaking into people's homes and stealing from them. By 15, his behavior had gotten worse, and he wouldn't just break in and steal things anymore. Now he would also move things around and leave things behind. He would misplace things purposely, making people wonder if somebody had been in their home. What he was doing was conducting a psychological game that he enjoyed. He was doing it just to mess with people. But very subtly, Not so obvious that you could ever be 100% sure of yourself. Purposely in a way that he knew you'd be questioning yourself, where the only thing that you'd be left with was confusion and uncertainty. By the age of 17, one of the homes he had broken into belonged to friends of Tina's family. It's speculated that this is how he obtained her phone number to begin with. Coming back to where we left Frank, he's in Tina's room. He just saw a bloody message painted across the wall saying, "Marry me," and on the other side of the room, a figure stood dressed in the clothing of his now deceased wife. Blonde hair hung down across the figure's shoulders, draping down to the hatchet that was held in his hand. The figure lunged at him, struggling with him for a few seconds until eventually pushing past him, somehow leaving him unharmed. As Frank turned to lay eyes on his attacker, they were nowhere to be seen. It happened so fast, he couldn't believe it. It was as if they had just disappeared into nothingness. Frank ran back to the neighbors as fast as he could and the police were called to the scene. But when they arrived, they couldn't find anybody else in the house. Frank was horrified. He didn't know what to do. For the time being, they stayed with relatives while Frank figured out what to do next. 2 days later, he would come back to the home to grab a few things. And as he arrived, before he got out of the vehicle, he noticed the same figure that attacked him was standing in view of the window. Frank began to panic as he called the police once again. What happened next even scared the officers. This is a quote from one of the officers that arrived on scene that day. "When I opened the door, on the right-hand wall, I saw a knife sticking out of the wall, and I see it's through a picture, a family picture. Written on it was, 'I'm still here. Come find me.' Now the hair goes up on the back of my head. On another wall, I saw another picture saying, 'I'm going to kill you all,' with a knife through it." They searched the house more thoroughly this time. Behind the washer and dryer, they found a piece of wood that was hiding a crawl space that led through the entire house. Referring back to the state of Danny and Tina, Danny didn't like how his calls were being ignored. He wouldn't take it lightly. When he was rejected, he broke into her house, happened to stumble across the crawl space, and for about a month he would torment them while lingering in the walls of their home. He would knock and tap on the walls. He would listen to them talk. He created peepholes in all of the rooms so he could watch them whenever he wanted. Those red messages? He was using ketchup to make it look like blood just so he'd get inside their heads. That figure that charged at Frank wearing his deceased wife's clothes? I think you've all figured out by now that that was Danny. He dressed himself up, put makeup on and a blonde wig, attempting to look like their mother. Whether he was doing that to actually convince the children that he was their mother's spirit, or if he was just trying to scare them is unknown. The last time the police were called, where they found the crawl space, they would find Danny curled up inside. He'd be charged with armed assault, sent to a juvenile detention facility for the next 10 months, and after that, released through a $10,000 bail in October 1987. This one decision would ultimately lead to the death of 3 people in the near future. Andrew and Priscilla Gustafson were a young couple who had been living in the small city for the past 5 years. They lived there with their 2 children, Abigail and William, and she was currently pregnant and awaiting another child. They lived roughly half a mile from where Danny lived. Not even a month after Danny was released, he would break in and steal items from their home, just like he did to many others. He would continue to do this to several homes in the area in the following weeks. On December 1st, Danny would return to the family's home while everybody was gone. Andrew was at work, Abigail was at school, and Priscilla was out to pick up William. The last time Priscilla would be seen alive was around 1 p.m. when she was picking up William from the babysitter. She would arrive home and Danny would hear her enter, and instead of leaving like he usually would, he found her and took her to the bedroom, locked William in a closet, then proceeded to sexually assault her until he decided to shoot her twice in the head. He obtained the weapon from a neighbor's home that he robbed earlier. Then he took William out of the closet, and he drowned him in the upstairs bathtub. Then he went to leave like nothing happened. Though before he left, Abigail returned home from school. So naturally, being the horrifying monster he is, he drowned her in the downstairs bathroom before leaving. Around 5:30 is when Andrew Gustafson would return home, and he would find the gruesome bloody leftovers of what had transpired in the main bedroom. He called the police before searching anywhere else. Recalling the events, Andrew would later say, "I was too afraid of going to look for my children because I was afraid I'd find them dead. It was so shocking and unbelievable. I screamed. I wailed." Officers had a feeling that Danny had something to do with it from the very start. A police lieutenant was on the search for Danny, and a resident of the area he was in felt like something was wrong. So she went up to him and asked him if he would help her into her home. She would later say, "I drove into the driveway and into the garage. I immediately drove back out and sit in the driveway feeling extremely uncomfortable." When they entered the home, Danny was actually there. He jumped out of one of the windows and got away as he ran into the forest. Later on a different street, Danny would force a different resident into her car. The resident would jump from the vehicle, and Danny would escape again. Later that evening though, 48 hours after the search began, they would finally find him hiding in a dumpster nearby. Hair from Abigail was found on his sock, sealing his fate in relation to the murders. Upon hearing that he had been taken into custody, Frank Bowen would say, "If Daniel Laplante does not get convicted and gets out again, I will personally kill him. You can't imagine what kind of fear we have been living in. He is mentally insane. There is no question about it. And now, I am financially broke and emotionally disturbed and trying to put my life together again." In 1988, Daniel Laplante was found guilty of all 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison. May you never see the light of day again, you absolute monster.